Have you ever stopped to think about why some of Jesus' actions caused more scandal than comfort? Why, at certain times, he seemed to do the exact opposite of what was expected of someone considered holy, pure, and full of power? This is one of those questions that, once they arise, never leave your mind. Because they don't just touch on an isolated episode in the Bible, they affect how we understand faith, religiosity, and God's own actions. Now imagine the scene. A sick, crippled man, carrying on his body what society at the time saw as a sign of guilt, sin, or punishment. Around him, people watch attentively, some full of hope, others ready to judge every detail. Everyone expects the same thing as always: a solemn word, a reverent touch, a clean, dignified, predictable gesture. After all, if it is God who acts, everything should follow a certain order, shouldn't it? But then Jesus does something that completely breaks this script. He bends down, he spits on the ground, and, with what for many was impure, he heals. Can you feel the discomfort of that scene? Because it wasn't just a miracle, it was a shock. A simple, almost brutal gesture that laid bare a deep tension between living faith and rigid religiosity. Jesus could have healed with a word. He had done it before. He could have avoided any controversy. But he chose to spit on the ground. And that wasn't by chance. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. A moment when you expected God to act one way, and he acted another. A path that seemed strange, disconcerting, even offensive to what you believed to be right. And then that silent question arises: did God make a mistake? Or is it that we create too many expectations about how he should act? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you even more than the act itself. For the religious people of that time, that act was incompatible with holiness. Saliva, earth, contact, all of these carried symbols of impurity. In their minds, the power of God should manifest itself in an elevated, distant, almost untouchable way. But Jesus does the opposite. He descends to the ground. He touches what is rejected. He uses what no one would consider appropriate. And it is precisely there that the miracle happens. This episode reveals something that many people prefer to ignore. Jesus wasn't interested in protecting religious appearances. He was confronting expectations. He was showing that God's power doesn't follow formulas, doesn't respect empty rituals, and doesn't fit within the limits we ourselves create. And this deeply disturbed those who thought they already knew how God should act. Have you ever wondered how often faith turns into control? How often do we expect God to move only within our rules, our logic, our spiritual comfort zone? This gesture of Jesus was scandalous not only because it was unusual. It was scandalous because it exposed a religiosity more concerned with method than with transformation. And perhaps that's why this story still resonates today. Because it doesn't just speak of a miracle from the past, but of how God continues to act in ways that challenge us, unsettle us, and force us to rethink what it truly means to trust. What follows reveals historical, symbolic, and spiritual layers to this seemingly simple gesture, yet carries a weight that few perceive at first glance. And perhaps that's precisely why this gesture continues to resonate within so many people to this day. Because, deep down, it forces us to look inward and ask ourselves if we are truly open to God's actions, or merely comfortable with the way we've always learned he should act. When Jesus spits on the ground, he is not just healing a man. He is touching on internal structures, on old beliefs, on expectations that have never been questioned. And that hurts a little. It's unsettling. It's destabilizing. If this topic resonates with you, if it touched you in any way, leave a comment below about what has caught your attention so far. Perhaps a memory, a personal experience, or even a question you've always kept to yourself. When you share, it's not just a comment. It's a conversation that begins, a bridge being built between people who are also trying to better understand faith beyond appearances. If this content resonates with you, liking this video is a simple yet powerful way to show that this type of reflection matters. It may seem small, but it makes all the difference in getting this message to more people who also need to hear it, reflect on it, and perhaps feel less alone in the spiritual process. Now, if you feel you want to continue exploring this type of content, exploring Jesus' gestures, silences, and attitudes that reveal profound and often forgotten teachings, subscribing to the channel is a natural step. It's not just about watching new videos. It's about being part of a community that chooses to look at faith with more depth, honesty, and sensitivity. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, keeping alive this conversation that so many people avoid but that so many need. And as you reflect on all of this, keep this image in mind. A simple, disconcerting gesture, laden with meaning, because there is still much behind this scene. Historical layers, hidden symbols, and lessons that go far beyond what the eyes can see at first glance. And it is precisely there that the story begins to get even deeper. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we understand the context, everything changes. The shock of that gesture doesn't stem solely from what Jesus did, but from the environment in which he did it. Nothing there was neutral. Nothing was random. Every detail carried a historical, cultural, and spiritual weight that the people of that time felt immediately, even if today we need to dig a little deeper to perceive it. In ancient Jewish culture, the idea of purity was not merely a moral issue. It was a mindset. There were correct ways to act, to touch, to speak, to approach God. Spirituality was deeply connected to rituals, symbols, and well-defined boundaries. And within this universe, both saliva and earth could be associated with impurity, with what should be avoided, with what needed purification. It wasn't just something strange. It was somewhat uncomfortable, almost provocative. The religiosity of that time valued the predictable, the acceptable, what fit into the patterns already recognized as spiritually correct. Miracles, yes, were expected. Healing, yes, was part of the messianic hope. But there was a silent expectation about how this should happen. A spoken word, a clean touch, a solemn gesture, something that preserved the appearance of holiness. The problem was never the miracle, it was the method. And this is where the story begins to reveal a hidden truth. Jesus doesn't just confront the man's illness. He confronts an entire mindset. By mixing saliva with earth, he breaks the logic of controlled spirituality, the kind that tries to domesticate God's power, fitting it into safe formulas. He exposes the inner workings of a faith that has become more accustomed to form than to real transformation. To those watching, it didn't seem authoritative. It seemed like a mistake. It seemed like an exaggeration. It even seemed like a lack of reverence. But, paradoxically, it was precisely there that authority manifested itself. Not the authority that asks permission from customs, but the authority that redefines the meaning of things. Jesus was not ignoring the law. He was showing that life is greater than the appearance of purity. This has an impact because it forces everyone around us, and, in a way, forces us too to confront an uncomfortable question. Is our faith more concerned with appearing correct or with being true? Because when God acts outside the script, the human tendency is to resist. Transformation rarely happens the way we imagine. It almost always begins by disrupting expectations, shaking up internal decisions, and dismantling old certainties. The spiritual journey of that healed man doesn't begin when he regains his physical sight. It begins the moment someone dares to touch his reality in an unexpected way. And this reveals something powerful. Often, the greatest miracle isn't what happens on the outside, but what happens inside, in the mindset, in the way of perceiving God, in how faith ceases to be theory and becomes a living experience. Historically, this type of attitude from Jesus was not isolated. He repeatedly chose paths that exposed the fragility of religiosity based solely on rules. He spoke to those he shouldn't have, touched those he shouldn't have, healed when it wasn't convenient. Each gesture was a silent revelation that the kingdom of God does not operate according to human standards of control and predictability. And that explains why so many people were bothered. It wasn't fear of Jesus' power. It was fear of what that power revealed. Because accepting that method meant accepting that God doesn't fit into boxes. That truth can emerge from places considered impure. That real faith demands surrender, not just outward obedience. When we understand this, we realize that that gesture wasn't improvised. It was a message. It was teaching. It was confrontation. A confrontation that spans centuries and reaches us, questioning our own spiritual structures. How many times do we reject something not because it doesn't come from God, but because it doesn't come in the way we expected? How many decisions do we fail to make because they don't seem spiritual enough, even though they carry genuine transformation? This scene invites us to look beyond the surface, to see that behind the discomfort there is purpose, that behind the scandal there is revelation, and that often what seems like a mess is precisely the beginning of a deeper, more honest, and more vibrant reconstruction. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we observe this gesture more closely, we realize that it functions as a silent spiritual language. Jesus doesn't act impulsively or spontaneously. Every movement carries intention. Every detail communicates something that goes beyond what the eyes can perceive at first glance. And perhaps this is one of the most disconcerting aspects of this scene. The miracle is not only in the final result, but in the path chosen to achieve it. When Jesus mixes earth with saliva, he is not merely using common elements of the environment. He is triggering an ancient, almost forgotten memory, deeply rooted in the history of the Jewish people. The earth directly refers to the beginning of everything, to the account of creation, to the moment when humankind is formed from the dust of the earth, molded by the hands of God himself. It is not a coincidence. It is a symbol. It is a revelation hidden in plain sight. Saliva, in turn, comes from the mouth itself, from breath, from the source of the word. In biblical tradition, the mouth represents authority, expression, creative command. God creates by speaking. The word generates life. When Jesus unites earth and saliva, what is happening there is not just an unusual method of healing, but a profound enactment of recreation. As if he were saying, without saying a single word, "I am not just fixing something broken. I am remaking it." This gesture communicates restoration at the deepest possible level. It's not a superficial adjustment. It's not a quick fix. It's a new beginning. It's real transformation. And this completely changes how we perceive miracles. Because in this context, the healing of the eyes is not the high point of the story. It's a consequence. The core of the message lies in the identity of the person performing the gesture. Jesus wasn't just healing eyes. He was teaching those who truly believed. This phrase summarizes a powerful truth that goes unnoticed by many. By acting in this way, he places himself in the position of origin, not merely of intervention. He doesn't appear as someone who asks something of God from a distance, but as someone who manifests within himself the creative authority. This is not just spirituality. It is revelation, and that's exactly where the impact happens, because this kind of gesture challenges the religious mentality that separates God from concrete action, that always places the sacred far away, untouchable, abstract. Jesus does the opposite. He brings the divine down to earth, literally. He gets his hands dirty. He mixes simple elements. He gets close to human frailty. And in this movement, he redefines what spiritual power means. This type of language plays on internal decisions. It forces the observer to choose how to interpret it. Either you see just a strange gesture, or you perceive a hidden truth being revealed. And this choice is not neutral. It reveals much more about the observer than about the one acting. Because miracles like this expose people's hearts. They expose expectations. They expose mental limitations. On the journey of faith, this is deeply uncomfortable. We prefer clean, quick, predictable solutions. But real transformation rarely happens that way. It usually comes accompanied by confusion, a breaking of patterns, and internal questioning. It happens behind the scenes of the soul, where old certainties are dismantled so that something new can emerge. This gesture of Jesus also points to something essential. Restoration is not returning to the previous state. It is advancing to a fuller state. When God creates again, he does not merely repeat the past. He inaugurates something new, a new perspective, a new way of seeing life, faith, God himself. Therefore, this miracle is not just about physical vision. It is about spiritual perception. And perhaps that's why this scene remains so relevant today. Because, even today, many people want a God who solves problems without addressing internal structures. A God who heals, but doesn't confront. Who helps, but doesn't transform mindsets. And Jesus, with this simple and scandalous gesture, shows that this is not possible. True healing always comes with revelation. When we understand this symbolic layer, we realize that nothing there is small. Nothing is casual. Everything communicates. Everything teaches. And this prepares the ground for something even deeper, because this gesture doesn't end with itself. It opens space for consequences, reactions, conflicts, and decisions that will reveal how far each person is willing to go when the truth manifests itself in an unexpected way. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the scene ceases to be merely intriguing and becomes confrontational. It is at this point that Jesus' gesture begins to challenge not only the religiosity of the time, but also our own way of living our faith today. Because ultimately, the discomfort was never about saliva or dirt. Discomfort has always been about control. The religion of that time was built on formulas. There were correct ways to act, right words to say, acceptable rituals, and others that simply didn't fit the pattern. This created a sense of security. If you followed the right steps, you believed you were on the right path. It was predictable, organized, controllable, and it is precisely in this scenario that Jesus appears, breaking all expectations, not with long speeches, but with gestures that disrupt the established logic. Jesus could have healed in dozens of other ways. He had done it before. A word would have been enough. A simple touch would have solved the problem. But, at that specific moment, he chose something that doesn't fit into any known formula. And that is profoundly symbolic. Because when Jesus acts like that, he is not just healing someone before the eyes of the crowd. He is dismantling the idea that the power of God can be domesticated. There's something within human beings that seeks patterns to feel secure. We like to know what to expect. We like to think that if we do everything right, the result will be predictable. But true faith has never worked that way. It demands trust, not control. It demands surrender, not domination. And when we try to transform God into a predictable system, something essential is lost along the way. When we try to control God, we lose the essence of faith. This phrase hurts because it touches on a sensitive point. It reveals a hidden truth that many people prefer to ignore. How often does faith become just a set of automatic decisions, repeated without reflection? How often does spirituality become a habit and not a relationship? Jesus confronts exactly this when he chooses an unexpected method. The gesture reveals a reality. God's power does not depend on techniques, fixed rituals, or established methods. He is not bound by our limited understanding. He does not need our approval. And that changes everything. Because, from that moment on, the question ceases to be, what is the correct way? And becomes, in whom do I truly trust? This confrontation is internal, silent, but profoundly transformative. It forces each person present, and each person reading this story today, to take a stand. Either you accept a God who acts outside your control, or you try to reduce God to the size of your comfort zone. There is no middle ground, and this choice shapes someone's entire spiritual journey. Behind the scenes of this miracle, something even more powerful than the healing itself happens. The religious mindset is exposed. The one that believes more in the process than in the purpose. More in the method than in the source. Jesus dismantles this with a simple gesture. Without directly attacking. Without verbally confronting. Just acting in a way that no one can fit into their categories. And this has an impact. Because what we cannot control, we try to reject. That which falls short of our expectations often frightens us. But it is precisely in this space of uncertainty that true faith is born. Not comfortable faith, but living faith. The kind that grows when we are forced to trust without understanding everything. This scene invites us to reconsider our inner decisions. To question whether our spirituality is based on formulas or on relationship. Whether we follow God because we trust Him, or because we believe we have learned the right way to make Him act. Jesus doesn't destroy faith there. He purifies it. He removes the artificial layers to reveal something deeper, truer, freer. And perhaps that's why this gesture continues to provoke so much reflection. Because it doesn't allow for neutrality. It exposes intentions. It reveals hidden motivations. It calls us to a transformation that begins from within, in the way we perceive God, power, control, and trust. All of this sets the stage for something even more intense, because when the formulas fall apart, something needs to fill that void. And it is at this point that the reactions of the people around you begin to say a lot about the kind of faith they truly carry within themselves. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because all of this isn't confined to the past, nor limited to a distant historical context. This gesture of Jesus resonates even today, crosses centuries, and encounters our own reality in a way that's much closer than we imagine. The question that remains isn't just what that meant that day, but what it reveals about how God continues to act now, in the midst of our journey, our decisions, and our spiritual expectations. Many people harbor the unspoken notion that God only acts within a certain spiritual environment, a clean, organized, predictable place, as if the divine needed to follow an acceptable script to be recognized. But this miracle directly shatters that logic. Jesus acts outside of what seemed appropriate, outside of what seemed respectable, outside of what seemed spiritually correct. And this forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. God is not limited to our categories. In practice, this means that divine action can arise in unexpected places, in confusing processes, in situations that don't appear sacred. Sometimes, God doesn't manifest in the beautiful way we imagined, but in the necessary way. And this completely changes our mindset, because it takes us out of the position of evaluators and puts us in the position of learners. There's a widespread idea that if something comes from God, it will be comfortable, clear, and immediately understandable. But history shows the exact opposite. Often, discomfort is part of the healing process. Not because God wants to hurt, but because certain internal structures only break down when we are thrown off balance. Growth rarely happens without some level of tension. Jesus' gesture teaches us that not every divine action will please our religious logic. Not every miracle will confirm our expectations. Some will even dismantle them. And this is not a mistake in the process. It is the process itself. True transformation almost always begins when what we thought we understood ceases to make sense. This has a direct impact on how we deal with faith in our daily lives. How many times do we reject experiences, processes, or internal changes simply because they don't fit into our preconceived idea of what is spiritual? How many times do we resist something that could restore us because it comes wrapped in discomfort, doubt, or unanswered questions? The hidden truth behind this miracle is that God is not committed to preserving our comfort zone. He is committed to restoration. And restoration often involves places we avoid, emotions we don't want to touch, and decisions that require courage. Jesus didn't choose a scandalous method by chance. He chose an honest method, a method that reveals who is willing to trust even when they don't understand everything. This practical application is deeply personal, because it invites us to look at our own history and ask, what if what bothers me most today is part of the healing process I'm avoiding? What if God is working exactly outside the place where I learned to look for Him? What if the transformation I hope for is happening behind the scenes, while I complain about the method? This perspective changes everything. It transforms faith into a journey, not a formula. Into a relationship, not a technique. Into progressive trust, not control. And that is liberating, although it is also challenging. Because it takes us out of the center and puts God back where He has always been, free to act as He wishes. Sometimes, what bothers us most is exactly what God uses. This phrase is not just beautiful. It is true. And it carries enormous emotional weight because it confronts our inner resistance. It makes us realize that the problem is not always in God's actions, but in how we interpret those actions. Ultimately, this miracle teaches us that discomfort is not a sign of divine absence. Often, it is a sign of active presence. When we understand this, something begins to change inside. Faith ceases to be an attempt to control outcomes and becomes a conscious surrender to the process. Decisions are guided less by the fear of making mistakes and more by the willingness to trust. The spiritual journey becomes more honest, deeper, more real. All of this prepares the heart to understand the reactions that arise when God acts in this way. Because not everyone reacts the same way to an action that deviates from the norm. Some open up, others close themselves off. Some draw closer, others are scandalized. And these reactions say a lot about the kind of relationship each person has built with faith throughout their life. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after all this, a question continues to linger in the air, silent but impossible to ignore. A question that runs through the biblical text, runs through history, and arrives exactly where you are now. What if the problem was never God's power, but our expectations of Him? This question is uncomfortable. It wasn't meant to be, because it forces us to confront something we usually avoid, the way we mold God to our image, to our limitations, to our preferences. We say we trust, but often we only trust as long as He acts the way we expect, as long as the method makes sense, as long as the path seems safe. Jesus' gesture lays bare this tension in an almost brutal way, because it reveals that true faith begins exactly where understanding ends. Jesus doesn't follow formulas. He never has. And perhaps that's one of the greatest challenges for those who try to transform faith into a predictable system. Every miracle, every silence, every unexpected action carries a message that goes beyond the immediate result. The miracle heals, yes, but it also reveals. It exposes the heart of the observer. It exposes the mentality of those who watch from afar and try to judge God's actions based on human criteria. When Jesus chooses a method that causes scandal, He is not being provocative for pleasure. He is being faithful to the truth that God cannot be molded, the truth that spirituality cannot be reduced to techniques, the truth that trusting in God is not about understanding everything, but about deciding to remain even when something defies logic. This is the most profound point of this story. The miracle reveals as much about God as it does about the observer. For some, that scene was merely strange. For others, offensive. For a few, revealing. And this continues to happen today. Faced with God's actions, some people shut down, others distance themselves, and some allow something within them to be transformed. True faith is not born from predictability, but from surrender. It doesn't demand control, it demands trust. And trusting is not passivity. It's an active decision to remain open, even when the path seems confusing, even when the method is not pleasing, even when the answer comes in a way that dismantles everything we thought we knew. This story confronts us because it challenges our secret desire for control. We like to think that if we do everything right, God will act in a specific way. But Jesus breaks this logic by showing that God acts according to His nature, not our expectations. And this completely changes the spiritual journey. Because, from that point on, the question ceases to be, how will God act? And becomes, do I trust in who God is, even when I don't understand what He does? There is a hidden truth here that only appears when we look more honestly. Many of our spiritual frustrations do not stem from the absence of God, but from the clash between what we expected and what He actually did. Discomfort, in this case, is not a sign of error. It is a sign of internal conflict. It is a sign of growth. It is a sign that something is being adjusted within us. Jesus doesn't explain the gesture at that moment. He simply acts. And that, too, is part of the revelation. Not everything will be explained before it is lived. Not everything will be understood before it is experienced. Mature faith accepts this. It moves forward even without complete answers. It understands that transformation happens in the process, behind the scenes of the soul, as we learn to truly trust. This final question doesn't end the story. On the contrary, it opens the door to something even deeper. Because after confronting expectations, methods, and formulas, what remains is to observe how each person reacts when God acts outside the script. And it is at this point that faith ceases to be theory and becomes a real, lived, felt experience. Comment below, this makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation truly resonated with you. It wasn't just about a strange gesture or an ancient miracle. It was about faith, expectations, and how we deal with God's actions in real life. If this kind of reflection helps you, challenges you, and makes you see the Bible more deeply, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey together. Here, the idea is exactly that, to go beyond the surface and talk about what usually stays behind the scenes. If you want, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." This shows that you've made it to the end and also creates a meeting point between people who are going through similar processes, each in their own way. If this content resonated with you, liking the video is a natural way to strengthen that connection and help this type of message continue to exist here. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click and continue reading it.